The girl tightened her grip on the microphone. Her hands were clammy, her heart hammering against her ribcage. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times, yet now, standing in front of the world's most influential entrepreneur, her throat went dry. She swallowed hard. There was no turning back. "Elon," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, stronger this time. "Do you believe in God?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, invisible yet heavy. Elon Musk blinked. His fingers, which had been idly tapping the table, froze mid-motion. He shifted slightly in his chair, his piercing eyes locking onto the girl. He wasn't one to shy away from difficult questions, but this one was different. For a moment he did nothing. The muscles in his jaw tensed, his lips pressing together in an unreadable expression. His mind raced, not with panic but calculation. How should he answer? Should he deflect? Be brutally honest? He exhaled sharply through his nose, as if clearing the clutter of 1,000 thoughts at once. His hands clasped together, fingers interlocking. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. His posture was deliberate, not dismissive, not defensive, but thoughtful. He studied the girl. She looked young, maybe 15 or 16. Wide-eyed, expectant, yet not naive. She wasn't just asking out of curiosity, she genuinely wanted to know. Elon's fingers drummed against the table once, twice, then stopped. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly, searching the girl's face. He could tell she wasn't asking for a rehearsed, politically correct answer. She wanted the truth. He took in a slow breath, then let it out. "I think," he finally said, his voice even but measured, "that's a more complicated question than it seems." The girl didn't back down. She leaned in, waiting, urging him to continue. Elon's lips twitched. Was it a smirk? A grimace? Even he wasn't sure. His fingers found his chin, rubbing absent-mindedly. "When I was younger," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I asked myself the same thing." He paused. "I searched for answers. Read religious texts. Explored philosophy. Science." His voice was steady, yet there was something underneath it, something unresolved. The girl's brows knitted together. She wasn't just listening, she was absorbing every word. Elon's gaze flickered across the room, then back to her. His lips parted and then he stopped. A faint smile ghosted across his face. Not out of amusement but anticipation. "Before I tell you what I believe," he said, voice low, deliberate, "let me tell you a story." Elon Musk leaned back in his chair, his eyes momentarily distant, as if staring beyond the walls of the auditorium, beyond the crowd, beyond even the stars his rockets chased. The girl's question wasn't just an inquiry, it had cracked open a vault of memories he rarely touched. He paused, the silence thick enough to feel. The audience held their breath, caught between curiosity and reverence. Cameras continued to roll, their red lights blinking like quiet witnesses to what was about to unfold. Elon's fingers traced the edge of the microphone stand, slow and deliberate. His mind wasn't in the room anymore. It had drifted back to Pretoria, South Africa. A boy with messy hair, no taller than the girl standing before him now, sat alone on his childhood bed, clutching a dog-eared science book. The pages weren't enough. They never were. At age 12, Elon had asked his first dangerous question, not to a person but to himself. What if none of this matters? The thought was a black hole, pulling him in deeper the more he tried to escape. Religion offered answers, but they felt incomplete. Too clean, too certain for a universe filled with chaos and contradiction. His mother had no answers, his father even fewer. So he turned to the sky. Not for prayers but for patterns. The stars didn't judge. They simply existed, burning with a truth too vast for words. Snapping back to the present, Elon inhaled deeply, as if dragging himself out of the gravity well of his past. "I was about your age," he began, his voice softer now, "when I realized that the universe doesn't owe us answers. It doesn't care if we're here or not. It just is." The girl's eyes didn't waver. She was still with him, tethered by invisible threads of curiosity. Elon's fingers tapped the table again, a rhythmic pattern like the ticking of an unseen clock. "But," he continued, leaning forward, "there was a moment, one I've never talked about publicly, that made me question everything I thought I knew." The room leaned in with him. "It wasn't during a rocket launch or some breakthrough at SpaceX or Tesla," he added, almost as if preemptively dismissing the assumptions brewing in the crowd's mind. "It was simpler than that. More, a human." His gaze drifted past the girl, staring at something only he could see. "I was alone, standing in a desert in Nevada. It was late. No lights, no noise. Just me and the sky, millions of stars, scattered like ancient messages we'll never fully decode. His voice dropped lower, pulling the audience closer without asking them to move. And in that silence I felt something I couldn't explain. Not awe. Not fear. It was like the universe was aware. Just for a second. Like it noticed me. The girl's breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. Elon's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers stopped tapping. I don't know if that was God, he whispered, but it was something. The silence returned, heavier now, thick with possibilities. Then he straightened, his face hardening, not with defiance but with resolve. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. The girl's grip on the microphone tightened. That moment came later, he said, his eyes locking onto hers. And it's the reason I'm answering your question this way. He leaned back again, exhaling slowly. Because some truths, he murmured, aren't found. They find you. The room buzzed with energy, but Elon Musk's words had cast a stillness over the crowd, like the calm before a storm. He had opened a door into something deeper, something more personal than any of them had expected. And the girl, her eyes wide with anticipation, leaned in as if to catch every single word that would follow. Elon's gaze lingered on her for a moment, assessing her as though she were more than just a teenager asking a simple question. She was a seeker, a kindred spirit in a world that had long been divided by the boundaries of belief and skepticism. Let me tell you something about space, he said, his voice resuming its steady cadence. When we send rockets to Mars, we don't just aim for a planet. We aim for understanding. We reach beyond our atmosphere not because we want to escape, but because we want to know the truth about what's out there. He paused, his eyes shifting to the audience, gauging their reactions. There was a quiet understanding but no answers. They were all waiting for the punchline. But Elon didn't believe in punchlines. Not anymore. When I was younger, he continued, his tone reflective, I believed that science could answer every question. I thought if we studied the right equations, discovered the right laws of physics, everything would make sense. It was all very logical, very linear. He chuckled softly to himself. But then I started digging deeper. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized how much we don't know. He shifted his weight, his fingers tracing the edge of the table again, his voice growing more thoughtful. The universe is vast. It's mind-boggling. But in all that vastness there are these moments, these tiny moments where you feel something more. The room held its collective breath. There it was again. That feeling Elon had described earlier, that something. Elon looked down for a moment, his brow furrowing as he gathered his thoughts. The girl watched him closely, her eyes searching for the meaning behind the words he hadn't yet fully spoken. It's not just about belief, Elon said, his voice quieter now, almost meditative. It's about the search itself. The pursuit of understanding. The fact that even in our most advanced scientific endeavors, we're still left with questions that don't have answers. And I think that's where faith begins to creep in. The words hung in the air like a delicate thread, connecting the infinite expanse of the cosmos to something more grounded. Something human. He paused, his eyes meeting the girl's. A subtle smile played at the corner of his lips. But there's more to this story, he said softly. And I haven't told you the whole truth yet. Elon Musk's gaze drifted once again, this time as if his thoughts were pulling him far away, back to a time that had shaped the person he was today. The room waited in breathless silence, drawn into the gravity of his words. I've been through moments, he began, his voice softer now, more introspective, when all the science, all the technology, it didn't matter. When the things I believed in, the things that I thought were the foundation of my life, those moments seemed to shatter. The girl was still holding the microphone, her hand gripping it so tightly that her knuckles were white. She was no longer just asking questions. She was trying to understand the man in front of her, this giant of technology and space exploration, a person who had touched the stars yet was now contemplating something as intangible as faith. Elon's eyes were distant, as if he were reliving something painful. He shifted in his seat, his posture becoming less controlled, more vulnerable. The people in the room could feel it. This wasn't the Elon they knew, the visionary, the problem solver. This was something raw, something real. I remember a night, Elon continued, his voice dropping, it was during one of the darkest periods of my life. I had just gone through a major failure at one of my companies, things were falling apart, and I found myself alone in the Nevada desert. No stars that night. No lights. Just emptiness. A shiver passed through the audience. It wasn't just the weight of Elon's words, it was the vulnerability he had just shown. The man who had built rockets to Mars was now describing a place where even his vast mind couldn't find answers. I was walking out there, in that vast emptiness. I'd been staring up at the stars for years, always believing that I could explain everything, that science could explain everything. But that night, something changed. It wasn't fear. It was something else. He looked down at his hands, almost as if seeing them for the first time. For the first time I felt small. In a way I'd never felt before. It was like the universe wasn't just this place I could study, it was alive. It was aware. It was. Elon hesitated, his lips parting to say something but faltering. Something was watching me. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the only way I can describe it. The girl was leaning forward now, eyes wide, hanging on every word. The room was holding its collective breath, waiting for the moment that would finally break the tension. But here's the thing, Elon said, his voice suddenly sharp as though snapping back from the reverie. That was the moment that broke me. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes there's more to reality than what we can measure. He looked at her, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them. That night was when I started questioning everything. Elon Musk sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping the table lightly, but his eyes, once distant, now seemed to sharpen with clarity. The audience could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air, each word he spoke threading the pieces of a puzzle that had begun to take shape in their minds. He had spoken of his doubts, his fears, and the existential crisis that had shaken him to his core. But now there was something else. A revelation, something he had never shared publicly, until now. I told you about that night in the desert, Elon said, his voice steady but carrying the faintest tremor, as though the memory still held power over him. But what happened after that is what really matters. The girl watched him, sensing that this was the turning point, the moment when all the scattered thoughts and feelings Elon had been grappling with would come together into something tangible. She gripped the microphone tighter, ready for whatever truth was about to be laid bare. I didn't have an answer to that feeling in the desert, Elon continued. I didn't suddenly become a believer in some higher power. But it opened my mind to something I'd never considered before. What if the answers we're looking for aren't out there in the universe? What if they're here within us? The room felt heavier now. The people around him leaned in, sensing the shift in his tone, the shift in his thinking. Elon wasn't just a visionary anymore. He was a man who had come face to face with his own humanity. I've spent so much of my life chasing facts, building rockets, solving problems, trying to push humanity forward. But that night, it made me realize that maybe the pursuit of understanding is just as important as the understanding itself, Elon said, his eyes locking with the girl's. There was something profound in his gaze, a silent connection that only she could understand. I don't believe in God the way most people do. I can't say I have all the answers or that I know what happens after we die. He continued, each word deliberate. But I do believe in one thing with all my heart, the search for meaning. He paused, allowing his words to settle. The audience, still, was hanging on to his every syllable, but it was the girl, her eyes wide with understanding, who seemed to absorb it the most. I think, Elon said quietly, almost to himself, maybe God isn't something we find. Maybe God is something we create. Through our actions, our relationships, the way we shape the world around us. The room was silent. The girl, standing before him, was no longer just asking questions. She was understanding something that no textbook, no scientist, no philosopher had been able to explain. And that, Elon concluded, his voice steady, is where faith begins. Not in knowing, but in striving. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and for the first time, the crowd understood that the question wasn't about finding the truth, it was about living it.